Hi, my name is Chris Brennan, and this is your horoscope for Capricorn and Capricorn rising for the entire year of 2020. Joining me today is astrologer Leisa Schaim.
Hey, Chris.
Hello. And we're going to be looking at your astrological transits for the next 12 months. So this is the 10th one that I've done. I've been doing a whole marathon of these all week, and somehow with the eclipse just happening in my 6th house, I made myself sick. So I'm actually losing my voice. So Lisa's going to help me and take over a little bit more than in previous horoscopes. Thanks for doing that.
Yeah, you're welcome. We'll see how this goes.
And we'll see how this goes. Thanks everybody who's joined us in the live stream. We are live streaming this recording today straight to YouTube. So why don't we go ahead and jump right into it?
Okay, sounds good.
All right, let's jump right into the astrology of January. So today is already January 10th when we're recording this. So fortunately, because it's taking forever, we're already kind of in the thick of some of the major astrological transits of this month.
Definitely. So there's a lineup of 3 kind of major things all in a row right now this weekend. So first we have the Cancer eclipse that's been happening today, January 10th. Then later today, Uranus stations direct at 2 degrees of Taurus. And then finally on the 12th, on January 12th, there's a Saturn-Pluto exact conjunction, which has been building, but it comes to the exact conjunction point on January 12th. So those are 3 things that could be major in themselves, but we have them all clustered together sort of in early to mid-January here. And so these are really the big pieces that dominate the month of January for 2020 for you. And for you, Cancer, since you're Capricorn rising, that's going to be happening in your 7th house of partnership. That can be personal partnership or business partnership or anything else you do with a heavy one-on-one concentration. So if you work one-on-one with people a lot, it could affect that area as well. So eclipses tend to bring major beginnings and endings. They're kind of chapters in a story. It's not usually that every single eclipse will bring a major beginning or ending, since they do happen in about 6-month intervals. But there is about a 1.5 year period where they're happening in 2 opposing houses in your chart. And during that period, particularly clustered around the eclipses, it's more likely a time for those changes to come about, or, you know, for you to either start something new with regard to that area or have some sort of culmination or even mini culmination. So for you, this is partnership with the Cancer eclipse in your 7th house.
Right. So there's some sort of culmination of events that have been building up, especially over the course of the past 6 months, since there was last a solar eclipse in Cancer. And then that would have been laying the seeds of the foundation for something in the area of relationships and partnership, which has finally grown and matured and developed and come to a point of just becoming more visible as a significant part of your life at this time. And of course, we had a solar eclipse, which occurred just a couple of weeks ago in Capricorn. That was the last solar eclipse in Capricorn, right?
The most recent one. We'll have another.
We'll have another?
Yeah, we'll have another this summer. That'll be the last one.
The lunar eclipse?
Yeah.
Okay. So, but there won't be any other solar eclipses, which means that 2 weeks ago, there was also some new 6-month phase that just recently opened of laying a new the seeds or the foundations for something that will grow in your life, especially with respect to your body or your mind or your character, that will grow and develop over the course of the next 6 months until it eventually reaches a culmination over the summer during that lunar eclipse, whenever that is, in like June or July.
Yeah, and eclipses in your 1st and 7th house are kind of a series of changes or shifts with regard to both you, which can be, like you said, Chris, the body or the mind. It can be things about your sense of yourself as an individual person, what matters to you the most when you're not focusing as much on other people in your life. And so it can also be changes in appearance or things of that nature, but it's basically how you present yourself or more attention on you as an individual. And so the eclipses have been bouncing back and forth between your 1st and 7th houses of self and partner, because shifts in either of those areas can easily, of course, affect the other. And so this one's going to be in your 7th. And so that could be anything from changes in your actual relating with a partner or, you know, meeting a partner or something like that. But it could also be things just having to do with your partner's life. Your partner is going through some major changes of their own and something of that nature. So that's that piece. Shortly followed up by the Uranus station in Taurus. So Uranus is stationing at 2.5 degrees of Taurus, and a Uranus transit is approximately 7 year long period. And so for you, that's happening in your 5th house, which has to do with children, sexuality, creative expression, if you do artistic things, or things just having to do with fun, going out and enjoying yourself. And so the Uranus transit through the 5th house, Uranus's signature is sort of unexpected changes or things kind of coming out of left field. It basically keeps you on your toes. And sometimes people can find Uranus shifts kind of jarring, but it can also bring unexpected good things into your life as well and cause you to sort of shake up your routines in whatever area that it's going through. So for you, that is your 5th house, like I said. If you have children, that can be some sort of unexpected change with regard to what they're going through or something like that. I always actually like to tell clients if Uranus is transiting their 5th house and they're not looking to have children to be more careful during those years, just because, you know, it's the nature of the unexpected in the children area.
Right. Unexpected children.
Yeah, exactly. Which
Okay.
can happen.
Mhm.
I mean, so, yeah, so other things you could innovate, you know, this could be really good for you if you do creative work. That sort of thing.
Incorporating like new technologies or
yeah.
seeking out new and innovative ways to like express yourself in different ways.
Definitely.
Also different hobbies, like finding offbeat hobbies or ways to bring pleasure and just what's the other term into your life for like pastimes or hobbies.
Just enjoyment.
Things you do for enjoyment.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so this is the area where that's happening. And so that's a long transit, but we're just pointing it out here because when Uranus stations, that's particularly noticeable because when a planet stations, it temporarily emphasizes whatever energy it expresses. And so there'll be 2 stations this year, and this is the first out of the 2.
Yeah, so it's going to be especially relevant if you have anything at 2 degrees of the fixed signs, which is 2 degrees Taurus, but also 2 degrees Leo, 2 Aquarius, or 2 Scorpio. In which case, if you did, it could be activating some placement in one of those houses, which could relate to financial matters or friends or other people's money.
Definitely. So that's the second out of the 3 clustered here in mid-January. The third one is the Saturn-Pluto conjunction. And that one is actually very focal to you because it's a conjunction in Capricorn, and Capricorn is your first house if you're Capricorn rising. And so that's the house of yourself. And when major transits go through there, which either Saturn or Pluto would be, much less both of them together, it's a major restructuring of who you are as a person, sometimes identity pieces, which can even be things like, you know, the first house can be all-encompassing and a little bit general, but it's just because it's so important to who you are. And so sometimes when Saturn transits through the first or Pluto transits through the first, it's sort of a major restructuring of who you think you are in the world and other life structures as well. You know, so it can even be career or partnership because this is kind of just all about you.
Yeah, and part of that transit, the Pluto transit, started back in 2008 when Pluto first moved into Capricorn and into the rising sign for those with Capricorn rising. But then more recently, 2 years ago in December of 2017 is when Saturn moved into that sign and returned back to its home sign of Capricorn and began transiting their first house of body and mind and character. So some major restructurings in those areas. Sometimes it can bring up some challenges for health matters or some setbacks or some obstacles that you have to deal with. I know sometimes people like lose weight under like a Saturn transit through the first house. It's one of the ways that I rectify birth charts because that can sometimes come up for positive reasons or negative reasons. The positive reasons can be getting more disciplined about your health and physical vitality. In other ways, it can be getting more disciplined about your character and like how you express yourself or how you appear to the world in general. So that transit's been going on for 2 years now, and we're entering the final phases of it. And part of the backdrop for this year, though, that's really important to mention is that those aren't the only 2 planets, outer planets transiting through that sign, but actually Jupiter entered Capricorn just a month or so ago, and we'll be spending the entirety of the year there as well, which is nice, especially for the people with day charts and kind of balancing out the heavy Saturn and Pluto transits that have been going on in that sign for quite a while now.
Definitely. So this can be for a lot of people, you've been thinking about restructuring something major in your life, or you've been working on a health challenge or a planned surgery or things like that. I've talked to some people with Capricorn rising who have stuff like that going on. But this is going to be a beneficial influence that kind of, as you said, helps balance out the seriousness of the Saturn and Pluto, and also brings more opening and opportunity to that area of your life. And so you might find it easier at this time if you've been trying to implement major changes or major restructuring in your life, or you were just planning on doing so in the coming year. This will help make that more beneficial for you, and also help it not feel quite as heavy.
Yeah, definitely. So it brings much more of a sense of like optimism and growth and expansion to this year compared to other years in your life. And especially compared to the past 2 years that Saturn's been transiting through that sign kind of on its own.
Yeah. And so the big picture is that Saturn will finish this transit of your first house in December of this year. So you've got just a little bit left. This is the third year out of 3. And Saturn and Pluto aren't new influences here. It shouldn't be really shocking or anything completely out of left field, but there may be a peak in activity because they're conjoining in January.
Okay. All right. So I think those are the major transits happening in January, and some of those are like long-term transits that are going to be in effect most of the year, like Saturn transiting through the first house or Jupiter transiting through the first. All right, let's move on to February.
Okay, sounds good. So February, one of the big shifts is going to be, or probably the most major shift, is Mars going into Capricorn in the middle of the month, around February 16th. And so Mars is then joining those 3 other planets transiting in your first house of self. So there's just a bigger pileup with regard to, whatever you're focusing on that time for major work on yourself. That can be, health matters. That can be how you present yourself. It can just be longer term things like we've been talking about of major life restructuring. But Mars can bring a sense of greater energy to whatever efforts you've been trying to do. But depending on, your specifics of your chart and whether you were born at day or at night, it could bring irritability as well, impatience to do whatever you're trying to do, because Saturn is kind of the long-term effort and Mars wants things done right now. And so there can be a little bit of a frustration with this transit, even though it will also probably energize you to do whatever you've been trying to work on.
Yeah, so maybe be careful about a propensity during this month-long transit of Mars through the first of a greater tendency towards irritability, towards impulsiveness, impulsive action, or just being sort of agitated. It can be good for getting things done and like making a concerted effort. But yeah, be careful about the potential, like Mars can be just a little bit too impetuous and can sometimes cause people to get into trouble or get into arguments more than they might otherwise.
Yeah, definitely. And also, be careful about your health, maybe a little bit more than usual during that 6-week transit, because the first house can have to do with that.
Yeah, with the body as well as the mind.
Exactly.
All right, so that transit starts on the 16th, but it's going to last all the way until the end of March, until March 30th. So weirdly, right about the same time that it starts on the 16th of February, there's a simultaneous other transit that's happening in parallel, which is that Mercury stations retrograde in Pisces conjunct Neptune. So this is the first of 3 Mercury retrograde periods this year, and it's happening in the 3rd house for those with Capricorn rising of communication, siblings, and short distance travel.
Yeah, so a Mercury retrograde can cause you to reevaluate anything in that area, whatever it's touching. So that could be reevaluation of your relationship with one of your siblings, if you have siblings, or any other actually assorted relatives also go in the 3rd house, so cousins and things like that. Also your neighbors, if you need to work anything out with neighbors, this could also be a revisiting of that issue. It will be just for a few weeks, so it's not a major transit, but it does dip tiny bit back into Aquarius at the end. So while it's in the Pisces house, in your 3rd house of siblings, short distance travel, etc., it is with Neptune. And while we're not really going to be focusing on Neptune too much in this forecast, Neptune is a long-term influence that's been transiting in Pisces in your 3rd house. And so that can bring a bit of nebulousness to things regarding any of those topics. Like there can be some confusion with regard to one of your siblings, your relationship with them, or There could be some sort of uncertainty with regard to interactions with neighbors and that sort of thing. So just keep an eye out for that, because this Mercury retrograde will be with Neptune. And that's true for everyone, but this is the area it'll be focused on for you. Then when it stations direct, it's going to be stationing direct just in the end of Aquarius, which is for you the second house of your income and possessions. And so they're not always tied together. When a Mercury retrograde touches two houses during its time backwards, but it can, for some people, connect possibly one of those third house topics and something about your own finances, either lending a sibling money, for instance, or some sort of interaction with a neighbor that requires you to spend money on something, that sort of thing.
Right. So it looks like Mercury retrogrades back into Aquarius on the 4th of March, and then it stations direct in Aquarius in the second house of finances on the 9th of March. So it's activating those two topics. Be careful, especially in the first half of the Mercury retrograde, about miscommunications with third house people, like siblings or neighbors. But then once it goes into the second house, it's revisiting and forcing you to go back and finish something or revise something with respect to financial matters. So yeah, that's wrapped up by the second week of March, and then Mercury starts moving forward. But what's interesting is that it seems to queue up some other financial transits that actually begin later in March in the same sign.
Yeah, definitely. So it's kind of an interesting March where Mercury stations direct near the beginning of the month. And then later in the month, about the third week, Saturn enters Aquarius for just a few month preview of its transit through your second house of income and finances. And then Mars, just a bit later in March, also enters your second house. So there's going to be a lot of attention moving towards that area. So even though the Mercury retrograde will maybe wrap up something smaller when it goes direct with regard to finances in your life, there's going to be more attention paid coming up. And when Saturn enters your second house of income, that's going to give all of us a little preview of what the Aquarius transit will be about, because Saturn transits are normally 2.5 to 3 years long. And that will come in full force starting in December. But from late March until July 1st, we do get a preview of the first couple degrees of Aquarius. And so for you, this is going to be a time when you start to need to think more carefully about your finances. Maybe you're restructuring something about your finances. You are trying to get a higher paying job. You're trying to figure out how you can manage your finances better, any of those type of topics.
Yeah, so a major restructuring of finances. Sometimes it can be a more conservative period for finances. It's like there's some years where things are just rapid growth and everything's great, but there's other years where you have to be a little bit more careful or things are a little bit more lean. And this seems to be inaugurating like a period like that, except it's just kind of a preview of it for this 3-month period from late March and through late June.
Yeah.
But it's interesting that it begins with a Mars-Saturn conjunction right at the end of March, which almost seems to imply, whether you have a day chart or a night chart, that there's some challenge or obstacle that might arise at this time that forces you to address it and deal with it, especially in the financial sector.
Yeah, and this can easily be something like, you lose some piece of how you make your income, like losing a job would be, I guess, worst case scenario. That's certainly not going to be true for everyone, but it's that kind of thing. Or conversely, like a greater expenditure that comes out of nowhere, like your car breaks down and you need to replace it, but you weren't expecting to put that money out right now, that kind of thing. So while this Aquarius transit does begin with something that's probably more stressful, either an external thing or at the very least just an internal stress of something about your financial picture, when it does come back later in the year, I don't want this to scare you as a preview, because it'll actually be probably better for most people when it comes back later, because it will be joined at that point by Jupiter instead of Mars. And so while this preview will give you a sense of what will require more attention down the road, starting at the end of the year, it won't feel exactly the same later.
Right. There's a little bit more optimism and balance when the transit gets fully going in December, because Saturn goes into the second house at the same time that Jupiter does. But in this early preview phase, there's a little bit more tumultuousness in this area because of this Mars-Saturn conjunction. That's going to be especially true for people that have placements at 0 degrees of the fixed signs, like 0 degrees of Aquarius, especially where the Mars-Saturn conjunction takes place, but also to a lesser extent, like 0 Taurus, 0 Leo, or 0 Scorpio.
Yeah, so that's a lot of what is important in March here.
All right, so March, and then that pretty much takes us through because the Saturn-Mars ingress, while it begins at the end of March, it carries through all of April, which takes us into that month. So there's April.
Yeah. So April starts early in the month with a Jupiter-Pluto conjunction on April 4th. And Saturn has temporarily, for a few months, moved out of your first house of self. So in a lot of ways, even though it's moving its attention on, sort of sober seriousness and that sort of thing towards your finances, it's in some ways alleviating that feeling to some extent for you because you're Capricorn rising. And so getting Saturn temporarily out of your first house will probably feel like a little bit of let up of pressure for you. It's not fully done, but so while it's out of your first house, this Jupiter-Pluto conjunction happens. And so that's a sense of whatever this long-term Pluto transit has been for you since about 2008, that's been kind of a very slow-moving but powerful push to transform something about who you are or your sense of identity or something major about your life. Jupiter comes along to kind of expand that feeling or that impulse. And so if you've been working on that already, this could be a time where you feel an even bigger push, or not just feel, but you're able to do a bigger push at this time to keep sort of growing and expanding in the ways that you've been wanting to do.
Yeah, so it's kind of nice then at this point with both Saturn and Mars out of Capricorn, just leaving Jupiter to its own devices. Some of the push for growth and expansion really accelerates at this point, and Jupiter itself probably accelerates some of the push for transformation, hopefully in positive ways that's coming from Pluto when it forms this conjunction in early April. So yeah, this is a good time to expand on things with respect to your body or with respect to your mind. I'm trying to think of like good body things that you could be doing, like beginning a new course of like a diet or exercise regime or something like that.
Yeah, definitely. Like those Capricorn risings who haven't been, taking care of their health earlier on, this could be a longer term transit where you're like, no, I need to get it together for the long term. So I stay healthy as long as possible. And so trying new things with regard to any of those types of routines could be helpful.
Yeah, it might just be worth noting that you're not like completely out of the woods with Saturn yet, because Saturn will retrograde back into Capricorn. So if there's a question about whether you're initiating something at this time and whether you'll run into any setbacks still in the future, there might be a little bit of like sweep up that's going to be due in the second half of the year when Saturn does retrograde back into Capricorn.
Yeah, definitely. That's good advice. And one other piece of advice I would say is, even though this should feel a little lighter for you and you feel like you have more room to push forward or expand with less constriction on you, one thing to be careful of with Jupiter and Pluto conjoining in Capricorn, Capricorn itself is a somewhat ambitious sign, and Jupiter and Pluto together can really make you feel like you want to grow and you want to build, and it can be very self-focused, which in some ways is very appropriate for you right now because it is in your first house of self. You just want to, I think the caution for Jupiter, for all of those transits in the first, and particularly when Jupiter and Pluto conjoin, is to try not to come off as too overbearing, because that could easily happen with that kind of like really ambitious push feeling going on.
Right. All right. So later in the month, the only other major outer planet transit is that Pluto stations retrograde in Capricorn, which is just an intensification of some of the same energies. So we can skip over that and move to May.
So May, Saturn stations retrograde just about 2 degrees of Aquarius on May 11th. And so basically since late March, it's come into your second house of income and finances. It's caused you to focus a little bit more seriously on that area. And now anytime a planet stations, as we were talking about before, it does just intensify whatever that energy is about. And so for a Saturn station, it can be temporarily feel like a more serious point in time where whatever issues have been brought up for you in your financial life, it's kind of front and center in front of you. So that's going to be retrograding. It's only stationing now to retrograde to go back into Capricorn, since it's only made it through the first 2 degrees of Aquarius. But that's kind of one major piece of what's going on here.
Okay. Yeah, so this is going to be the final time of really figuring out what that long-term Saturn transit's going to be about, like you said. And for some people, that's going to be like a light restructuring of financial matters. For other people, it might be a more intense long-term period of having to deal with some setbacks or some problems in that area and figuring out how to adjust accordingly. It's interesting, though, that the Mars transit ends just a couple days later. So it seems like this is a turning point, because Mars then leaves the second house, Saturn stations, where it's going to begin the slow move to move out of the second house. So it seems like definitely for the people with day charts that there's some alleviation of whatever the issue was, at least temporarily at this point, around the 13th of May when Mars leaves that sign and goes into Pisces.
Definitely. So then Mars will go into Pisces, which goes back into your third house of siblings, neighbors, short distance travel. Not really a major transit, but it does get out of your financial house. Then Jupiter stations retrograde and Venus stations retrograde right around the same time in the middle of May. And so the Jupiter station retrograde isn't a huge deal. The Venus retrograde will be happening in your sixth house, which has to do with, interestingly, that can also have crossover with health things, just like the first. I would say first, sixth, and 12th can touch on health matters. So it can be a revisiting of something around your health routines. The sixth house also governs things like coworkers, employees, if you have any, and generally things about your work routines, whether that's things you're getting done at home or things you're getting done in the workplace. And so a Venus retrograde, like any retrograde, can cause you to just revisit any of those topics, kind of go back over and see what's not working. There could be someone, since the Venus retrograde, which sometimes has to do more with people coming back, in a general signification sense, Venus retrogrades are sometimes known for like ex-relationships coming back or that sort of thing. Since it's happening, that could be true for anyone, but it's also happening in your sixth. And so that could be something like people you used to work with or old employees coming back to you. It's not necessarily the case that in any of these situations that you need to stick with them for the long haul, because sometimes Venus retrogrades are more like, you at first are like, oh, I remember that. That was so nice. But particularly with this one, Venus is actually stationing retrograde exactly square Neptune. And it kind of intensifies further or exacerbates further the potential for not seeing things clearly with regard to whoever comes back or whatever you're revisiting in that time. So, and that can go both ways. You can either see people as sort of more idealistically than you should, or conversely, you could only see the problems with people you work with or who work for you.
One scenario I'm thinking of is like revisiting an old job and like thinking about whether you should take an old job again, and having maybe an unrealistic image in your head of like how great it was before, but then you like go back to it and remember that it wasn't as great as you thought it was.
Definitely.
Or alternatively, something like that, because the sixth house is also employees. So there could be a similar scenario with like somebody who works for you or comes back to work for you. One of the things you might want to be careful about during this time is that with Mars also ingressing into the third house of communication during this time, it could be a period in which you could be a little bit more combative verbally, or you could be a little bit more, not forthright isn't the right term, but what's a similar term? Like
brusque.
Brusque?
Yeah.
Yeah, and like maybe getting into trouble in the workplace as a result of maybe being a little bit too brusque in your communication style.
Yeah, that could be. So Venus retrogrades from that point forward and into June. So it is oftentimes best, whatever you're sort of reviewing or thinking back on at that time, it is best if you can, if it's possible, to hold off on any decisions that you might need to make regarding any of those things until after it does go direct, because it'll station direct right near when Neptune's stationing direct. So this particular Venus retrograde is way more Neptunian than usual. So there could be, lack of clarity kind of floating around for everyone involved, really.
Sure. And then also, did you mention like health stuff?
Okay. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So the sixth is, similar, has some overlap to the first house because they can both be involved in health. So that's kind of interesting for you with Capricorn rising, since there's kind of a focus in two ways at that time.
Yeah. but just some potential nebulousness surrounding health issues around that time, especially around the time of the station as a potential.
Yeah, or having to go back for a second opinion or something like that, reviewing something.
Yeah. So you can think back to 8 years ago was the last time that Venus went retrograde in Gemini in the same sector in your chart. And that could give you some preview of what this Venus retrograde could be somewhat about.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So I believe that takes us on to June.
All right. So June, one of the first things that happens in June is the first eclipse in Sagittarius. And so we've been in the Cancer Capricorn series of eclipses for about a year now, and there's still a couple more left here this summer, but there's also this stray Sagittarius one that kind of moves in and starts off that series that will begin more in full force at the end of the year, in November and December. So this is the very first one in Sagittarius. And so eclipses can sometimes bring beginnings and endings with regarding to the areas that are happening in for you. And the Sagittarius one for Capricorn rising is going to be in your 12th house, which is kind of a hidden house. It has to do with things that happen behind the scenes, sometimes, time that's needed to be alone, sometimes reasons that you're taken out of the everyday, day-to-day life, such as if you get sick and, things. So you have to be home for a while. The 12th house does govern other things that are sort of even more secluded, like hospitals and prisons and things like that. But it's just sort of something that's hidden area for you. So with the eclipse happening here, it's interesting. I will double up and say, everyone with Capricorn rising should, not be fearful, but do keep a handle on any health things that are coming up for you, because the 1st, 6th, and 12th are those 3 houses that can touch on that. Mm-hmm. So for some people, that could mean like a period of time where you get sick and you need to like stop working for, temporarily.
Sure. Yeah. Having a lunar eclipse, which is like a full moon, a supercharged full moon shining a spotlight in the 12th house, can bring just greater attention to both physical as well as mental health. Mm-hmm. And maybe if there's anything that you need to be addressing or haven't been addressing, this might be a time when you start to put greater attention on that area of your life. Mm-hmm. Other topics associated with the 12th house are things like people that you don't get along with in your life. It could bring greater attention to that area of your life and needing to resolve or address some of the issues that you have with those people. Mm-hmm. The 12th is also the place that has to do with instances where we sometimes undermine ourselves. And if there are areas in your life where you've been undermining yourself, it might force you to focus on those areas more in order to see if you can stop doing that or manage it a little bit more constructively than you have in the past. Yeah, for sure. Any movements in the 12th house, particularly more major ones like an eclipse, can kind of shine a spotlight on things where you're not, you can have a skewed perspective in some way in the 12th house, like, and be like, something about your subconscious where we all have like, maybe at least one thing where we don't necessarily see completely clearly in that topic. And so it can just sort of be like, oh, right, that's something that's activated for me right now. That won't be for everyone, but for some people that might come up. And I would also say, you're only getting the 12th house eclipse now, not the 6th. But since there was a retrograde as well through the 6th, and then at the end of the year, the eclipses will be happening in the 12th and the 6th. This is starting to bring your attention to the balance in your life of work and rest. I see that a lot when there's eclipses in the 6th and the 12th. People are kind of struggling to, not always struggling, but trying to figure out how to rebalance those topics in their life. And oftentimes, for many people, it is because they're overworking. And so they need to, start to, what are you laughing at? I'm not sure what you're talking about. This is actually not a pointed comment. Okay. Well, I just recorded 10 horoscopes in a row, and this eclipses are falling in my 6th and 12th houses. Right. And I feel like that's a little pointed. Well, it just happens to be true without me actually saying it with the motivation of being pointed. No, I have actually, I know it's funny, but it may be true for you at this time, but it is also, I've seen that with tons of people, really, struggling with, I'm sorry, you're making me laugh. I've seen that a lot when people have, with clients, when they have eclipses in their 6th and 12th and it's not always from becoming sick, although sometimes it is. But even if it's not from that, it's often a sense of being burnt out or feeling stretched to your limit and realizing you can't work 24/7. And so, and sometimes with the eclipses, I am not someone who says, this has only happened to
bring it to your attention if you got it, sick at this time.
Mm-hmm.
But nonetheless, these do bring up that balance for you. And so you may have to like figure out a new, like, actually, I'm working too much. How do I take alone time for myself, which is a 12th house topic? How do I rest enough so that I go back into the world refreshed after that kind of thing.
Sure. So that's a good keyword. So the balance between work versus rest.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is something that they're just inching into. Like you said, we had the Venus retrograde, and then we've got this eclipse here, but it's really later this year, around November and December, that this eclipse series will fully get going, and that'll be that shift towards that topic, and that axis of houses will be much more, not dramatic, but much more firmly in place at that point.
Mm-hmm. Much more active later. So this is starting it off, so giving you a sense of what that's about.
Okay. All right. So that's just like one eclipse that we just spent a while talking about at the very beginning of June.
Yeah.
Not the only eclipse.
No, there's like 3 so usually there's 2 every 6 months, but sometimes when the nodes are shifting between signs, then you can get like a stray one that's, kind of wide out in one direction or another. And so you have 3. So anyway, we have that one in Sagittarius in your 12th house of hidden places. Then we have later in the month, a Cancer eclipse on June 21st. And that is going to be in your 7th house of partnership. We talked about that earlier. This is going to be the last Cancer eclipse in that area of your life.
Yeah. So this is a solar eclipse. So it's a new moon, supercharged new moon in your 7th house of relationships. But what's weird about it is it actually happens around the same time as the second Mercury retrograde of the year, which is also in Cancer. And that begins on the 18th of June.
Mm-hmm.
So Mercury goes retrograde in your 7th house of relationships and partnerships. So there could be some need to go back and revisit something involving your partnerships, whether it's a romantic partnership or a business partnership, potentially to reassess it or renegotiate something in that area of your life. And for whatever reason, during the process of doing that, that ends up laying a new foundation or sets the seeds of something that will grow and develop in terms of relationships for you over the course of the next 6 months.
Yeah, definitely. So I normally don't put a ton of emphasis on Mercury retrogrades because they happen 3 to 4 times a year. They're just a few weeks at a time. And unless Mercury is activated for you through some sort of timing technique, like annual perfections or something like that, they're not usually super major. But in this case, like you just mentioned, it is tied into the same exact area in your life as the eclipse. And so it may be a more important revisiting this time because it's tied into, potentially something that's a bigger change. So, so that will go, and this retrograde will actually start in Cancer and end in Cancer. So all the attention is in Cancer in your 7th house here.
Yeah. And so during the course of that, Venus eventually stations direct on the 25th of June and ends its retrograde cycle in the 6th house of work and health.
Mm-hmm.
And then shortly after that, the last major shift that happens is that Mars moves into Capricorn on the 27th of June.
In Aries.
Oh, Aries. Yeah. Okay. Mars moves into Aries, which is the 4th whole sign house in the sector of the home and the family and the living situation for those with Capricorn rising.
Mm-hmm. And this is, normally a Mars transit is only going to stay in a certain house of your chart for 6 weeks. But this year is a little unusual because Mars is slowing down to go retrograde later in the year. It will station retrograde in September, direct in November. The upshot of that is that Mars is going to stay in Aries for 6 months instead of 6 weeks, which is a pretty big difference. And so for the entirety of the second half of 2020, the planet Mars, which has to do with assertion, self-will, sometimes conflict or tensions, is going through your house of home and family. So that could bring a lot more energy towards the private area of your life. That can pertain to your actual living situation, like your house or your apartment. It can pertain to things involving family members, particularly parents or your relationship with your parents. Or just, things involving anyone else you live with at home. And so Mars transits there. It's a very active influence, particularly in Aries. It's not a very gentle influence. Usually you kind of want peace and quiet, or most people do in their home. And so this is going to be more something needs your energy. You need to fix something, maybe with a Mars transit there. You might, have an argument with someone you live with, that kind of thing.
Yeah. So Mars can generally indicate a period of like strife or conflict, or at least tension in the area that it's transiting. So if you're here in this context, it's the home and the living situation of the parents. It could create a kind of tumultuous situation in terms of your living situation for a few months. That's going to be particularly important during the 2 stations, especially when Mars actually stations retrograde in September, especially if people have placements around 28 degrees of Aries, which is the actual degree it stations, or to a lesser extent, 28 degrees of the other 3 cardinal signs, Cancer, Libra, or Capricorn.
Yeah, for sure. And this will differ a bit depending on the specifics of your birth chart. It won't be the same for everyone. It will be more tensions for people who are born during the day, whereas if you're born at night, it might just be more like you have to expend more energy in that area of your life or attention, but it won't necessarily be like a super conflict.
Yeah, it could just be like doing a lot more work at home, or like initiating some sort of major, like even like a construction project or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. So it's still energy, but it depends on, the specifics. Anyway, so we're kind of dwelling on it now for a moment. It will become more important later, but this is when that transit begins. And so it will, the themes related to that in your area of home and family may start to arise at this time.
Yeah. All right. And that takes us into July. And the major stuff in July happens largely right at the top of the month.
Yeah, so right away, the first day of July, July 1st, Saturn retrogrades back into Capricorn, into your first house of self. So that transit we were talking about earlier in the year, starting off the year in January, it did leave in late March. You got a little bit of a let up in terms of that serious focus on transforming, who you are in the world, or major changes in your life, and or to your health routines or things like that. It's coming back now for the last time. That is the final stretch from July until about mid-December. And in terms of, the bigger picture, it's been for about 3 years. It'll be a 3-year transit by the time it's done. And so this isn't that big of a deal. This is like 5 months left. But it is back into your first house. And so it does become central for you again.
Yeah, and there's a lunar eclipse in Capricorn immediately after that. So both of these are repeating or re-emphasizing a similar theme, which is like finishing something up and bringing something to completion and starting to see the results of a long-term series of activity that have been taking place over the course of the past 2 or 2.5 years.
Yeah.
And really starting to see some of those efforts come to fruition, especially in the first house in the sense of self, and the long-term impact of those transits in terms of either some bodily changes and changes in terms of your physicality or physical health over the past couple of years, or alternatively with respect to your character or your mind and some of the characteristics that you've been developing and cultivating that might be new in your life in some way.
Yeah, definitely. So a lot of this will be already underway and in process well before now, unless you have placements in very late degrees of Capricorn. Then this could be more of a focal point in time. But for many people, this is something you've already been working on for a while. Now, if you don't see the results yet, or if you still feel, particularly once Saturn goes back into your first house of self, like a sense of like, I've been working on this forever, and when is this going to let up? Because it can be a heavy feeling transit for sure, and for some people more than others. Just know that Saturn transits often also pay their dividends after they're done. And so even if you still feel like you're laboring at whatever this is, a major change in your life, or responsibilities in your life, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're off track, because it may still pay off after the transit is finished.
Sure. And it might be partially tied in with, because it looks like the Mercury retrograde doesn't finish until the 12th of July. So it's kind of notable that we're having this sudden shift in first house activity, but it's kind of happening in opposition to this Mercury retrograde in the 7th house, which is causing some sort of reassessment in the area of relationships. And it may be that something that happened or is happening during this time in June and July in the relationship world is forcing you to define better who you are and your sense of self and what you want out of your life, as opposed to like your partner, or as opposed to some of the close personal relationships that you've had.
Yeah, definitely. And that can easily happen, if you are partnered. Anytime that you redefine your sense of who you are, that can affect how you relate with a partner, how they relate with you, because maybe something has changed that then they have to adjust to. And vice versa. If your partner has been having changes in their life, then that forces you to readjust. So it is kind of like a dialectic going back and forth between these two houses for you, and particularly right now.
Right. All right. I like that word, dialectic.
Thank you.
We're using big words at this point in the horoscope videos.
This is the big word horoscope forecast.
Right. All right. That's pretty much it for July in terms of the major transits. It's just those two major Capricorn shifts at the beginning, Mercury going direct, and then we move into August.
Okay. So August, let's see, the major thing, honestly, even though it looks like on the calendar here visually that there's lots going on, many of these are quick interplanet transits. So the biggest picture thing that's happening in August is going to be Uranus stationing for the second time out of two for 2020. Uranus is stationing on August 15th, and it will be stationing retrograde at about 10, almost 11 degrees of Taurus. And so for you, the topics we brought up at the top of the year in January with regard to unexpectedness or ups and downs or, innovation with regard to fifth house matters, which is children, sexuality, creative expression, things like that, or things you do for fun. This is another point when you're in a stations in the middle of August that there may be an intensification of whatever is coming up for you around that. And that's going to be particularly so if you do have fixed sign placements around 10, 11 degrees. So any planets at 10 degrees of Taurus, or to some extent, 10 degrees of Scorpio, Aquarius, or Leo.
Yeah, because this is the furthest that Uranus has gotten into this sign. So for people that have placements around 10 degrees of fixed signs, it's really going to be the first time it fully hits some of those personal points in their chart.
Mm-hmm.
And so the real sense of either disruption or excitement, or in some instances, just like rebelliousness, will really become much more prominent, even though they've been there in the background ever since Uranus went into Taurus a year or two ago. It's definitely going to hit a peak point at this point for some people, especially in the area of either children and sexuality, 5th house, 8th house, shared resources, 11th house, friends and groups, or 2nd house, finances.
For sure. And if you're in the dating world, not everyone will be, but if you are, that can make things regarding dating, because that often goes in the 5th house, things that aren't established partnerships, particularly exciting, but also potentially up and down, or just, what's the word I'm looking for? Not admirable.
Just like unstable or short term.
Yeah. Exactly.
Okay. Definitely. I think that's a good delineation. So that's really the main thing that's happening in August. It's just that Uranus station. There's other like interplanet transits, but nothing we need to dwell on. That takes us to September. And September is one of the more notable months of the year because this is when Mars actually finally stations retrograde.
Yeah. So the three major things that happen in September. First, on September 9th, Mars does station retrograde in Aries in your 4th house of home and family. The other couple of things we'll touch on are Jupiter stationing direct a few days later and Saturn stationing direct near the end of the month. And so Mars stationing retrograde in your 4th house of home and family, we mentioned that when it first went in at the end of June. So any energy you've been expending on the area of home and family or things involving your parents or your living situation, I don't want to say revisit because that's not even strong enough term. It is that because it's turning retrograde. And so it's literally going back over the area that you've already covered up to this point. There may be a sense that, especially since Mars is retrograding at 28 degrees, it's almost all the way through the end of the sign. And so you may have a feeling at this time that like, oh, I've already done this, everything's handled. And then something comes up where you have to go back over what you've recently been working on in that area for some reason. And so sometimes, a keyword for both the Mars Saturn when it went into Aquarius and also this Mars retrograde is a feeling of frustration. This one is more of a, I thought I already had that handled, or sometimes like an anger, conflict can come up at this time when it does station direct because it's an intensification of Mars energy, which is like what you want coming up against potentially what someone else wants in your home or living situation. So this is going to be retrograde until the middle of November, so a little over 2 months. So this is the time period where you can expect to go back over whatever you've been doing in this area of your life and try to figure out what you need to do to reroute it to get it moving forward again. But it may take a little bit.
Yeah, and just looking at the chart for when Mars actually stations retrograde, one of the things that's interesting is that it does so pretty closely square to Saturn. So Mars stations at 28 Aries and it's squaring Saturn at 25 degrees of Capricorn. So it may be bringing up some real instances or real issues surrounding like your home and living situation and family, and that creating tensions with you and your sense of like self and your want to differentiate your own personality from, let's say, your family or your family background or something about your living situation.
Yeah, definitely. And squares are natural tension. So it is literally, something in this area is coming a little bit at odds with something in this other area, and you somehow have to handle both. And so it's not that you can just focus on one or the other. And that's what creates that feeling of tension, in addition to Mars being one of the planets in this particular square. It's interesting for Capricorn rising that you have, simultaneous to these long-term transits, and you're first sort of redefining your sense of self or who you feel you are in the world, with things going on in your 4th house of home and family or parents and your 7th house of partnership. There's a lot of stuff going on this year with regard to who you are and other people in your life and interpersonal relations.
Yeah, that really seems to be one of the big themes this year, of just that axis of like 1st house self, 7th house other, and 4th house origins or foundations.
And with this Saturn-Mars square in particular, with it stationing retrograde in Aries in your 4th house, I could easily see this. It will play out differently, of course, for everyone with the specifics. But, Saturn is like, I'm working on this stuff for myself, for what I need. But you simultaneously, then something crops up in your home or living situation or with your parents that you need to handle at the same time, while really wanting to continue focusing on what you're trying to do for yourself. And somehow you have to juggle both of those.
Right. That makes sense. So yeah, that's one of the things happening in September, is Mars stationing retrograde. Additionally, we have Jupiter stationing direct in Capricorn, which is positive, especially for those with Capricorn rising. And even at the end of the month, Saturn stations direct in Capricorn and makes its final direct station, which also seems kind of notable, especially for those with Capricorn rising.
Yeah, and the Jupiter stationing direct is a little bit of a saving grace this month, I think, especially just a few days after that Mars retrograde. It doesn't negate that. They're in different areas of life, but the Jupiter stationing direct, just emphasizes further that sense of opportunity or expansion in the area of self for you, or openings, or, things saying yes instead of no. And so that does help out quite a bit here. And that makes it direct for the rest of its time this year, I believe, right?
Yeah, I mean, this is the final direct station of Saturn, and then it's going to be heading on its way out of Capricorn for the rest of the year until it finally departs in mid to late December.
Yeah, so that's really nice. And that's a bright spot in this month for you in particular with Capricorn rising, because it's so focal to you and your chart. Then Saturn stations direct near the end of the month. And that will mean, even though it is a final intensification on that feeling of like responsibility, hard work, restructuring, which is also very focal to you because it's transiting your 1st house of self, this is the last push. This is really the last push. We did mention the last push when it went back into Capricorn, but as it stationed, it was still retrograde. So as it stations direct here, this is really like the last bit. And it's interesting that Jupiter and Saturn are both stationing direct in the same month here in September, because they're both in your 1st house of self. And it's kind of like, okay, I'm not thinking of that phrase, but, something going ahead, basically. Yeah, right. I'm missing a catchphrase here. Mars isn't going ahead yet, but Saturn and Jupiter are in your 1st, and that's very helpful.
Yeah, I mean, it just seems that whatever the tensions are that are happening in the home and living situation or with the parents somehow are connected to, or might prompt a period of growth and development and becoming more mature with respect to the sense of self, with these two planets stationing direct in the 1st at the same time. And that seems positive for the most part. I mean, I guess it depends on what specifically they're hitting in the birth chart in terms of those degrees.
Yeah.
But it could be constructive in the long term.
Yeah, for sure. And again, this won't be true for everyone. Lots of different manifestations possible, but I could see a sort of allegorical situation here where maybe you've been working hard to get a new job or something like that, or, improve your professional situation. And because even though this isn't the professional area per se in your chart, sometimes that happens just with Saturn going through the 1st, as greater responsibilities being put on you and you kind of rising to the occasion, even though it takes a lot of work. And so you could be doing that and finally attaining something new, but it causes you to have to move. And then, you spend several months figuring out where you're going to live for the new position. That's not going to be true for everyone, but that's the kind of thing it can be.
Sure. All right. So I think that's going to take us then out of September and into the astrology of October.
Okay. So October, we start early on. Pluto stations direct on October 4th. That's just kind of an intensification of the same themes that we have been talking about. There is the last Mercury retrograde of the year that starts in mid-month on October 13th. It stations retrograde in Scorpio, which is going to be your 11th house of friends and groups and associations, networks of people. And then, yeah, that's the major thing actually that's happening in October, I think. Nothing other that bigger that I'm missing, right?
No, Mercury stations retrograde in the 11th house.
Yeah.
It retrogrades back into the 12th house. But
Into the 10th.
most of the month is dominated by that.
Uh-huh.
You're right, 10th house.
Yeah.
Into Libra. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. So Mercury is retrograding in the house of friends and groups for you. So there may be people that you used to be friends with, or old professional networks, or, you know, something about your social sphere that either comes back at this time from a previous time in your life, or there could be miscommunications with regard to people you're friends with or something like that, or groups you belong to. And so that retrogrades, the retrograde period is just for a few weeks. It does retrograde through that 11th house and then end at the very end of Libra, which is your 10th house of career and public reputation, supervisors if you have one. But it's the work house, basically, the sort of more professional work house. And so for some people with Capricorn rising, these topics could be tied back together, thinking of something like, you know, I don't mean to focus so much on the job thing, but Capricorns often are focused on things like that. So maybe it's not terrible. So maybe you get back in touch with an old friend, or they get back in touch with you and they're like, oh, there's actually this position for, you know, would you like to take it? Or something like that, just because the retrograde is happening through the friends group and through your professional sphere.
And one of the things about that that's potentially notable and relevant, worth mentioning here, is that Mercury, when it stations at 11 degrees of Scorpio, opposite to Uranus at 9 degrees of Taurus, which almost seems like there's something unexpected or something disruptive that comes in the sphere of friends or groups or alliances that sort of like precipitates whatever the Mercury retrograde odyssey is over the course of the next 3 weeks.
Yeah, that could be. So yeah, then it stations direct in Libra at the beginning of November. We're not to November yet, but that's basically one of the main things going on in October.
Yeah, so retrogrades back into Libra on the 27th, and then it stations direct on the 3rd of November in very late Libra. Like you said, in the 10th house of career. Around that time, it stations square Saturn in late Capricorn, so possibly connected. This is actually like the final other cardinal house that it's actually filling out this year, just to like get all 4 of them. It seems to come very late in the year, where we have another transit that's happening in the 10th house, so the other major sector of the chart. So that means in the end we do get somewhat notable transits in all 4 of the angular houses for the Capricorn rising people this year.
Definitely. Yeah, so for some people, like I was talking about earlier with potential job things, you know, that could actually come up at this time more so, just because even though a Mercury retrograde isn't a huge transit, it is stationing direct then in your 10th house of the professional sphere, square Saturn transiting in your 1st house of self.
Right. All right. So this is taking us into November, and aside from Mercury stationing direct on the 3rd, the other major thing that happens is that Mars stations direct at about 15 degrees of Aries on the 13th of November in the 4th house of the home and living situation and parents. Yeah,
so we've talked about that a decent bit at this point. So whatever has come up for you over the past few months, since Mars was in your 4th house of home and family, and then went retrograde in particular since then, since early to mid-September, this now is a possibility of starting to get it straightened out. Mars moves pretty slowly when it stations direct, so it won't be up to speed immediately, but this is the next major turning point where, you can start to put plans in place for smoothing things out in this area, whatever has cropped up for you going forward, even if you can't make it all happen immediately.
Right. So at least we're starting to see the end of that and the resolution, hopefully, of some of the challenges or the tensions that have occurred in this area of the chart over the past few months. And then Mars will start making its way out of that sign between now and the early part of next year.
Yeah. So you still got a bit to go in terms of Mars transiting your 4th house of home and family, but this is the turning point where it can start to move more smoothly or at least more directly and figure things out.
Sure. So by this point, we also enter into eclipse season again by the end of the month, starting on the 30th of November with a lunar eclipse in the sign of Gemini, which is the 6th house of work and health.
Yeah, so we talked a little bit about that earlier with the Venus retrograde in the summer in your 6th house in Gemini. So this brings up a lot of those same themes, coworkers, employees, your own work and health, health routines, that kind of thing. So eclipses are activating also what I was talking about earlier with that Sagittarius eclipse in your 12th in the summer. This now moves into that whole axis of 12th and 6th, which is, work and rest. And so this is the work part.
Right, because there's 2 weeks later, there's a Sagittarius solar eclipse, which takes place on the 14th of December. So now the eclipses have fully shifted to that 6th house, 12th house axis where they'll stay for the next year or so.
Yeah, so basically, if health things come up for you, best to get them checked out. It won't always be a reactive thing. It can also be proactive. So this can be a good time for you to start new health routines or things like that, to revisit what you're doing to maintain your health, because 6th house is a lot about, your daily routines, whatever they are.
Yeah, and since this is a lunar eclipse that's taking place in the 6th house, there's probably something that you initiated in this area, either in your workplace or with respect to your health and physical vitality that was initiated 6 months earlier that starts to come to culmination at this point, and you start to see some of the results of it. So it's like if you started going to the gym over the summer or something, you may now start to really see the difference 6 months later and how it's changed your life in some notable or significant way.
Yeah, for sure. And it can go back and forth too, because then 6 months after this, we're going to get the opposite. So it's kind of an ongoing story here with regard to those topics.
Yeah, some of the changes that happen in our lives happen more like waves rather than a singular push, but instead it's like multiple attempts to push something into place in your life, and then sometimes it takes a few tries until you can really get the ball rolling.
Yeah, definitely.
All right, so those are the 2 eclipses between the 6th and the 12th house axis in late November and early December. And this finally brings us to the final month of the year, and perhaps one of the most notable or momentous general, just mundane astrological transits of 2020, which is the much anticipated Jupiter-Saturn conjunction, which takes place in December, shortly after both of those planets move into Aquarius, with Saturn moving into Aquarius on the 17th of December and Jupiter moving just 2 days later into that sign on the 19th.
So Saturn moving back into Aquarius does put that focus on work and attention and effort for the next few years with regard to your financial picture, whether that's how you make a living, your source of income, like your particular job, or how you manage your own finances. But whichever are coming up for you at this time, it'll be a revisiting of that little dip we had into that area from late March to July 1st. But it'll probably be a less stressful reentry because Jupiter is also attending here. And so when you have Jupiter and Saturn both going into your 2nd house of finances, it's so much more helpful than Saturn alone, whereas Saturn is about kind of contraction and, how am I taking care of my resources? Maybe I need to spend less, things like that. But Jupiter is simultaneously an expansive or opportunity-oriented transit where that can bring openings with regard to those same topics for you. And so it's a little bit of a push-pull in the sense of expansion versus contraction. And this may be an ongoing thing for the next year for you as far as, how do I try to expand and be hopeful in the area of my financial life, but not expand too far and be responsible and cautious. It's those kind of tensions, but they're not the tensions of like the Mars-Saturn we saw earlier in the year, where that's a much more frustrating feeling of like stop and go. This is a more gentle tension, I would say.
Yeah, the attempt to seek and establish equilibrium in one's financial life and in terms of one's assets seems to be the major signature of this transit, and most of that won't really be experienced fully until 2021, because that's going to be a major backdrop of the entirety of the next year of 2021. But for some reason, we get that preview of it a little bit early this year in 2020 between March and June, and then it fully starts here in mid-December.
Yeah, so this is the kickoff to the next following year of those transits in your second house of finances. Saturn will continue on after that, but Jupiter will just be the next year.
Right. Nice. Well, that seems pretty good. And it also, as you said, completes the long-term transit of Saturn through the first house for those with Capricorn rising, which I have to feel like even if it pushes the attention towards the second house, there's some feeling of breathing a sigh of relief, of having sort of weight lifted off your shoulders by the end of the year, and sort of getting through kind of a more heavier part of one's life and moving into something that's a little bit lighter.
Yeah, definitely. Saturn transits through the first can often feel similar to like Saturn returns in the sense that you have more responsibility, things feel more weighty temporarily. You're maybe working hard for a while without seeing the results quite yet until later, you know, things like deferred gratification, basically. And so that's what that Saturn transit has been like for you since December of 2017. And so finally, at the end of this year, December 2020, you will be finishing that 3-year-long transit. I want to give everyone like graduation caps, even if you haven't been in school, just because it's that kind of feeling like, okay, we did it. You know?
Right. Yeah, I like that. Success and a reward for like a job well done for putting in the hard work.
Yeah.
But really, I mean, most of this year has a little bit of that as well, with Jupiter transiting through that sign and already the initial phases of like letting up a little bit after a couple years of more challenging just Saturn transits.
Yeah, that's true. People don't always get Jupiter transits while they're having Saturn transits to their first. So that is a nice bonus this year.
Definitely. All right. Well, those are pretty much the last major transits for 2020. And we're already like getting ahead of ourselves and talking about transits for 2021. So I think that means we have to call it a day. And that's the end of this yearly horoscope for 2020 for Capricorn and Capricorn rising. Cool. Thanks for joining me for this today and for carrying me through this on your shoulders. I appreciate it.
Quite welcome. I hope you can hold up for 2 more signs.
I'm not sure how I'm going to do, but we'll see what happens. Yeah, thanks everybody who joined us in the live chat. We had like 100 viewers, I think, consistently. So thank you. Appreciate it. Please be sure to like this video. That helps us out. Also subscribe. And once the video is posted, post some comments and let us know how these transits have been working out for you, especially through some of the houses that we mentioned, like Saturn through your first house or other things like that, and just how it's been going or what you anticipate coming up in 2020. All right. So we have a few things we needed to mention. We've been using the artwork from our astrology calendar posters this year. So we released all of the artwork that we used in this episode. We released as posters so that you can see all of the major transits in the year at a glance, including the lunations and the retrogrades and the major outer planet conjunctions and ingresses and everything like that. So you can find out more information about those posters at theastrologypodcast.com/2020 posters. Leisa and I also released a electional astrology report for 2020 where we went through and we picked out one lucky date or electional chart for each of the next 12 months, right?
Yeah, so we went through all of 2020 to pick out the best date and time period for each month to start new projects or hold events or anything that you want to go better to kind of hedge that. So yeah, we've done all that work for you. And so we're looking forward to people starting events with these.
Cool. So you can find out more information about that at chrisbrennan.astrologer.com/2020 elections. And then finally, we have to give a shout out to all the patrons who support the production of episodes of the Astrology Podcast through our page on Patreon. In particular, a shout out to patrons Christine Stone, Nate Craddock, and Tanner Robinson, as well as the AstroGold Astrology app available at astrogold.io, the Portland School of Astrology at portlandastrology.org, the Honeycomb Collective Personal Astrological Almanacs at honeycomb.co, and then finally, there are 2 major astrology conferences happening this year. One of them is hosted by the International Society for Astrological Research, which is hosting a conference in Denver, Colorado, September 10th through the 14th, 2020. More information about that at esar2020.org. And then finally, the Northwest Astrological Conference, which is happening in Seattle, Washington, May 21st through the 25th. More information about that at norwac.net. So if you'd like to become a patron and get access to early access to new episodes or other bonus content, you can find out more information at patreon.com/astrologypodcast. All right, that is it for this yearly horoscope. So thanks again. Thanks everybody for watching, and we will see you next time.
Yeah, have a great year.